Welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Is pre-competitive collaboration the key to a sustainable blue revolution? Brought to you by seafoodsource.com and sponsored by GSI. We have a few housekeeping notes to go over before we get started. If you have any technical questions about using WebEx, please use the chat box and we will respond right away. If you have any issues with the audio, you can click on the phone icon above the chat window to receive teleconference information. For those that do need to call in, to ensure call quality, everyone's lines have been muted. But we do want this webinar to be as interactive as possible. You can ask questions at any time using the Q&A question box. When selecting who your question should go to, please select all panelists. Please note that we will have our presenters answer questions at the end of the webinar. And just to note that that chat box above the Q&A box is reserved for technical support issues only. So if you have any non-topic related questions or issues, please use the chat box and I will respond right away. If you happen to get disconnected, you can log on again using the instructions provided in your confirmation email. But if you continue to experience difficulty, please email webinar@seafoodsource.com and we will respond right away. So our speakers for today are Avrim Lazar, Ricardo Garcia, and Einar Wathne. And at this time, I would like to welcome them all and have Avrim start his presentation.
Thank you. And hello, everyone out there in computer land. For all three of your presenters today, this is our first experience of a webinar. I have to say, personally, I would prefer to speak to a live audience of 1,000 people than to 10 people on a webinar. But we'll give it a try. Please cheer us on and encourage us. So the topic is pre-competitive collaboration, the key to a sustainable blue revolution. Usually when we talk to people about pre-competitive cooperation, at some point they say, well, what's so new about that? You mean people talking together and working together? It's pretty normal stuff. And in fact, it's kind of the essence of being a human. I mean, the scientists have come over the last 20 years to more and more conclude that the success of our species has been social. It's not just that we're kind of clever animals. It's that we're animals who know how to work together to common purpose. So most of human progress, be it social or intellectual or material, has been the result of people cooperating. The human genius, both the evil human genius and the creative human genius, is mostly a function of social activity. And of course, within social groups, there is always competition. People looking for their own advantage, people looking to rise up the hierarchy, and between social groups, there's almost always competition, and the competition can be vicious even. But what we're talking about is something a little more specific than that, and that's companies who normally compete, suspending competition, and deciding there's an opportunity which they want to address together. They address that opportunity, and then they go back to trying to beat each other up. It could be a common threat. It could be an unrealized opportunity. But it's the idea of suspending the normal competitive activity and, for a specific thing, choosing to work together to solve a problem or realize an opportunity. And I think it says at the bottom of the slide, the capacity to distinguish between shared-sum and zero-sum games can be critical. Because, for example, if you wanted to increase the market share of shrimp or salmon or tilapia, sometimes it's best to work together to grow appetite and market for your product rather than to try and beat each other up. And our experience, and I certainly have had experience with this in many different industries, our experience is that generally business leaders tend to miss the opportunities for pre-competitive collaboration, not because they're not capable of seeing it, but because the structure of business is competitive, and we're kind of trained that our job is to beat the other guy, and we are less often sensitized to the possibility that we would do better working together sometimes. So let's look at some of the ways in which pre-competitive collaboration can help the bottom line. I mean, one obvious one is market reputation. In almost every sector, certainly in salmon, but other seafood sectors as well, people think about farm salmon more than they think about any particular brand. Where there's criticism, at the local level, it can be of one particular company, but mostly it's of the whole sector. Where there's bad attitudes or prejudices or unfair myths, it's usually about the whole sector. And so when you get together in a pre-competitive way, you are helping everyone in the sector prosper. And if you try and do it yourself, it's very unlikely you'll succeed, partly because it's hard to create that much market differentiation, partly because it requires a certain critical mass, and also partly because if you're doing the right thing and your neighbor's doing the wrong thing, you're going to suffer the reputational damage that your neighbor has caused. In fact, that was why we started the Global Salmon Initiative at the beginning, was recognizing that market reputation is a commons, we all share in it, and bringing up your competitor in terms of their environmental or social responsibility is in everyone's interest, because we're all vulnerable to what each other does. You can make the same argument for social license or community relations. It's really the overall reputation of the entire sector that determines the fate of any one company within the sector. Less often talked about, but and sometimes even more important, is using pre-competitive collaboration to accelerate innovation. Normally, the business model is that within your company, you find or you imagine where huge wealth can be gained by innovating here, innovating there, or making 20 small innovations, but you're looking for advantage by changing technique, using new technology, changing how things are done. You can actually accelerate innovation enormously when you compare notes. So if one company, for example, let's take control of sea lice as an example. If each company tries to figure out how to do it in their own isolated box, everyone will make the same mistakes. Some people will make different mistakes, but no one will be learning from each other's experience. And in many cases, the competitive advantage of being the first company to solve something is small compared to the economic advantage of finding the solution quickly. It's true, everyone benefits from it, but that shared benefit is often far more than the competitive benefit of being the first mover. And as many of you will have experienced, you get a short-term boost by being the first to figure something out, but one way or another, most others follow your lead quite quickly. So finding solutions to problems together quickly is worth more than finding them in isolation and competitively. And then lastly, managing biology. One of the distinguishing features of working in the oceans is that they are integrated ecosystems, and if one person is trying to deal with a disease and does it in isolation from everyone else, biology does not know company barriers. It crosses company barriers, and you can manage biological challenges, be they algae, diseases, pests, the health of the local ecosystem. Because you work in the same waters, working together is almost always better. So basic message here is there are many times in which suspending competition leads to making more money than continuing to compete. And when I say suspend, you solve a problem, and then you all go back to trying to do better than your neighbor. But we don't just live in a world of business. We also live in a world that goes beyond the bottom line. You know, when I was a child, we used to write on our notebooks, you know, Avrim Lazar, Planet Earth, North America, Canada, Ottawa, Glebe Avenue, this school, third desk from the right. We live in a series of nested contexts. And even though we are all business people, hoping to make lots of money and to make our shareholders love us, we are also part of a larger human enterprise. And that human enterprise, which we are proudly part, is feeding the world. Spend any time in a relaxed atmosphere with a farmer, and there's a deep satisfaction of being part of this righteous human enterprise of trying to feed the world. But we also know that with growing population, with huge demands on the food system, that it's really hard to reconcile how much protein is going to be demanded and needed and the world's capacity to close that gap. If you look at the increases in productivity in terrestrial aquaculture, it's pretty close to flat line. Innovation is not coming quickly enough, partly because of resistance to GMOs. Arable land is just not available. Water is not available. And if you go beyond that to the carrying capacity of the Earth, it's really hard to reconcile the carbon footprint, the pollutant footprint, the water use of increased food production with the already strained carrying capacity of the Earth. And the answer to that is pretty simple. Either we feed people less, we have less people, or we figure out something really smart to do, create more food with less impact. And that's where the rate of innovation becomes an existential question. Not just how quickly can we figure out to do things better, faster, with a much less environmental footprint, but also the rate at which all those innovations get diffused and adopted becomes not a question of profit, not a question of competition. It becomes an existential question for humanity. And if you talk to those who spend their time worrying, you know, at the FAO or the OECD, worrying about how the world's going to be fed, it's the rate of innovation and the rate of diffusion and adoption of innovation that is the essential issue for feeding the world. And pre-competitive cooperation is a necessary tool. If we all try and find the solutions in a closed room, A, the solutions will come more slowly. Science and technology works by people openly sharing what they are learning. And B, the diffusion will be slower because people will quite properly hide the stuff that they paid to develop. So pre-competitive cooperation is companies that are normally competitors solving a problem together. If you can figure out where to do it, you can make more money. And when we choose to do it, we can fulfill our basic mission of finding a way of feeding the world. Einar, with that, not Einar, Ricardo, with that, I pass the torch to you.
Thank you, Avrim, and thank you for joining this web seminar. Let me provide you with an example of a company that has joined GSI from the very beginning, and I want to share with you our experience. And the first question that I will respond is, why did Camanchaca participated as a founding member of GSI back in 2012 when we decided that it was time to do it? At that time, Camanchaca was coming back from a major event happened in the past decade in Chile, the ISA crisis, and we were recovering from that massive loss that we had 10 years ago. And despite that recovery and the many challenges that we had at the point, we saw the need of something bigger for the very long term. We envision and realize then that sustainability is something that is shared within the participants in the industry. Every individual behavior in our industry has an impact in the environment and in the reputation that we have. But the point that we realized then was that we do not internalize properly the cost and the benefit of those actions and behaviors that we have vis-a-vis the environment and the reputation. That is all the good things that we do for the environment and not totally captured by the one that does it, nor the benefits on reputation. Likewise, the negative things that might happen on the environment and or reputation are also shared. And because of these differences between what I can internalize and what is shared with others, we ended up doing a little less than the good things and sometimes a little more of the bad things. And GSI was an opportunity and a vehicle to internalize those externalities and therefore realize progress vis-a-vis reputation and sustainability. We also saw a great opportunity to share experiences and practices with the main companies in the globe, and particularly the experiences and what can be shared within the CEO group, which I had the privilege of found in 2012. The possibility of working together in key sustainability areas such as biosecurity and the sustainability of feedstock, particularly on marine ingredients. The opportunity to work together to try to organize and have a little more rationale on how we measure progress and how are the standards by which the industry is being evaluated. Communicating within the companies the fact that we want to be more sustainable in salmon farming. And lastly, the reputation, which is something that we care for the long term. And finally, one of the reasons why we participated is because we really genuinely wanted to make salmon farming more sustainable, to be able to meet the world increasing demand for healthy protein while we minimize the environmental impact. That was something that we envisioned back then, that it was not possible to do it alone or individually, because we end up doing something much less than what can be achieved by the group. GSI is actually a breakthrough in accelerating industry sustainability progress. It's a unique case where an industry, many in the industry, stand up and work together for a more sustainable supply. That has not been seen in any industry, particularly on the food industry globally. And we created this group based on 3 core principles that we have fight during these years to keep intact. To be able to measure our progress in sustainability by independent standards, to cooperate pre-competitively, because we think that the environment is a dimension where we can collaborate and not compete, And lastly, and very important, transparency, to make sure that the regular reporting that we show progress are completely transparent to all our stakeholders. Next, the collaboration and not competition when it comes to environment is, as I said, very important. We have promoted knowledge exchange between the companies and better practices, collaboration that has enhanced the breadth of impact within the industry of all the good things that we do, and important, a paradigm shift. It's not about the good and the bad players, but how can we all get together to provide a more sustainable food. What are the successes that we have seen during these years? I think that today we are all committed to be 100% ASC certificated by the end of this decade. Today we are 25% already. We have involved in our endeavors key suppliers such as feed and pharma suppliers to the industry that support the sustainability progress that we are aiming to do. And also to mention the strategic partners that we have brought on board, particularly WWF and the FAO from the United Nations, that have played a key role in helping us moving the frontier. And lastly, and I think it's very important because of the transparency, members have already completed the second or the third sustainability report, which is a report that we publish through GSI, where key performance indicators related to sustainability are available to all stakeholders. Also, a very important thing is the high level of communication that we have within the companies and within the CEO in subjects that are related to how to become more sustainable salmon farming. What are the learnings that we have? I think that we have proven that we can solve some of the externality problems that we have in relation to reputation and environmental impact. The ambitious goals that we put on us for long term is very critical to become the most sustainable source of protein in the world, to be 100% ASC certificated, and to substantially enhance the reputation of the industry are goals that are very ambitious for the long term and for which we are fighting for. We have already involved the company leaders. That's something very important to move the wheel, to commit to participate and act. The participation of the company is critical and is always a challenge. Having an open mind to new ideas, very honest speaking, and to be able and willing to share our good practices. And lastly, there will always be challenges in the industry, and we have to understand that sustainability is not a goal. It's not a static and fixed indicator, but it's rather a path, because we have an ever-moving benchmark, and what is sustainable today might not be sustainable tomorrow, because society changes, technology changes, and the information that we have on our impact in the environment also progress. So it's something that we will never become fully sustainable. The issue here is to become more sustainable. So it's a path. That's very important. I think with that, I have provided you our experience in Camanchaca with GSI and why we believe that GSI is a critical factor in becoming the industry more sustainable in the future. With that, I leave you with Einar, our next speaker. Thank you.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I guess we have a global audience here and are in different time zones. My name is Einar Wathne. I'm representing the feed side of the supply chain that is supporting the seafood contribution through aquaculture to the consumers globally. We have been invited in from the initial start of the GSI, and as a feed supplier, we have had very interesting experiences being a part of that initiative, and we have actually obtained some remarkable successes that I would like to share with you, and I hope that has some interest. First of all, I would like to talk a little bit about the supply chain, because when we are talking about sustainability, when we're talking about transparency, when we're talking about trust, it's not among stakeholders. It's not only the one part of the supply chain that is covered. It needs to be the same practice needs to be valid for the entire supply chain, from in aquaculture, from where the ingredients comes from to the food is supplied or is on the plate of the consumer. That means that supply chain involvement is a part of a sustainability story, of a transparency story, of a reputation story. And that was why it was natural to have feed suppliers as a part of this initiative from the very early start. And we had a definition phase very early after it was established to say where are the non-competitive areas where we can contribute. And obviously we could contribute around communication, around sharing information, around sharing what we are doing and what is it actually these animals are fed, where does it come from. But in the dimension of sustainability, we actually took this a little bit further, because we also said if we want to have a sustainable development and growth of this sector, what are the limitations we might see in the future? And we started then a series of avenues, not too many. We wanted to focus. But we started looking at the priority list where really the supply of omega-3 fatty acids, EPA, DHA fatty acids that comes from the marine food chain, that could be a limitation for growth in aquaculture, and actually then be a sustainability threat, because we might do something that wouldn't let the coming generations do aquaculture the same way as we are doing it. So we started in a stream of information gathering to look into how does this perspective for omega-3 supply look if you take a longer perspective than we normally do. That means make projections for sources of omega-3, growth of aquaculture, growth in other consumers of omega-3 fatty acids, and see what's needed in order to have a sustainable growth of production. So we reviewed the levels of EPA, DHA in feed. We looked into the efficiencies. We looked into alternative non-marine sources. What could that be that could help us if the marine sources of omega-3 could not grow any further? And we mapped available resources. And the big challenge here, as most of you are aware of, is that omega-3 originally comes through the marine food chain, and it ends up in fishes that are caught higher up in the food chain, that are then from there we are extracting fish oil, and those fish oils have until recently been the only available source for omega-3 fatty acids. This initiative that we started then identified a need in the future to find alternative sources, because we identified that with the projected growth in aquaculture and the lack of being able to take more out of our oceans, we needed to identify or find other sources. And what we then were able to do was to try to align with technology groups, with innovative companies that was into this space, mostly in the food supplement area, and we brought up the story of the gap that we would reach sometimes after 2020 in supply of omega-3 fatty acids. We invited those as an industry, including competing feed companies, farming companies, and other stakeholders in the GSI, invited those technology groups to present their solutions and future views. And at the time when we kicked off this project, there were nothing that was commercial in any scale of alternatives to make omega-3 fatty acids. But as we evolved this, we made those companies then aware of the gap and also their future market potential to supply not only a few tons, but tens of thousands of tons of what we call novel oils, novel omega-3, novel EPA DHA oils. We launched this through several steps, and actually we formed a tender that was going out open, was launched 2 years ago during Aquaculture in Trondheim, and we launched this tender asking with backup from the farming companies in GSI that we are willing to buy a certain quantity of specific alternative sources of EPA and DHA oil. And that tender was launched in 2015. It gave a lot of promotion, and I can also remember personally we had just been acquired by Cargill, and Cargill leadership said they had never seen any such initiative in the history of the feed sector for any animals. So this was a novel approach. What we did, we sent a significant market signal that there is a need for alternatives, and there is an industry that is ready to pay. And to make a long story short, we created so much initiative that when we got the tenders in, we had several suppliers, we had the scale that we needed, and we actually decided not to go into a joint legal complicated contract, but let then the players, the members themselves, evaluate, take these proposals into a commercial realization. And we are today in a situation where there are multiple providers of amongst algae oil and other biotechnology-made oils that is available in commercial scale, and that is actually used among our members and other players in the sector. And we have now already, we know that we have sources that can help us, and we can ensure that we can grow with sustainable sources of omega-3, providing the healthy product that we need to have from someone. So this is a kind of experience that is new to us, but it has been inspiring for the feed players. It has glued together the value chain, joining a focus that I don't think really, maybe the farming companies wasn't fully aware of, many of them were not. And we have been able to present ourselves and our future needs in a way that has accelerated innovation. And it has been done in a way that is fully in line with what is competitive legal rules. And we have, in a way, resolved a potential environmental threat before it occurs. So it is an example that we can work for speeding up innovation. We can make bolder innovation steps by working in a pre-competitive way. How many other examples we can bring up with this caliber might be hard, but it is a very good example that this is doable and can be applied also in other areas. By this, I will pass the word back to Avrim to round off the presentation.
Thank you, Einar, and thank you, Ricardo. And just a couple of sort of lessons learned, which I think are worth rehearsing, because the stepping in and out of competitive relationship is not what most of us have been trained to do. It's worth just rehearsing a few things. One is you've got to be really clear about what you're doing and what the boundaries are. So we know, for example, in GSI, we are cooperating to improve the sustainability of our sector and in so doing, improve the reputation of the sector. That's clear. And as soon as we start moving into cooperation for something else, inevitably one of the CEOs says, that's not what I joined for. So being really clear, because if you're not clear, the blurry lines between what you're competing on and what you're not competing on can be quite dangerous. The other thing is you've got to be really clear, because there's only narrow areas in which pre-competitive collaboration is acceptable to legal authorities. Second thing is you've got to be really good at listening, and we find this all the time, that because people like to be agreeable, and because they come from different regions, different company cultures, there's a tendency to agree to stuff in which there's not really agreement. People say yes, but in their mind they think they're saying yes to a different thing, to a slightly different thing, or sometimes to a very different thing. And so we've learned to check, to feedback. Am I hearing you correctly? What this implies. Because the cost of agreeing to different things and thinking that you've agreed to the same thing can be huge, both in terms of efficiency, but also in terms of quality of relationships. And that brings us to time. When you're in a company, you can do things relatively quickly. Lines of authority are clear, purpose is clear, company culture is clear. You can choose to take your time, or you can choose to decide. When you're working among peers, going too quickly can be penny wise and pound foolish. You make faster progress by stopping, taking a breath, and taking the time to collectively understand and commit to strategies. Authority. Pre-competitive cooperation almost never works when it's just at a mid or even a senior level. It has to come from the CEOs. The decision to suspend competition is not one that a technical person can make. That doesn't mean that all the work has to be at the highest levels, but the mandate, the objective, the scope, the boundaries, the commitment to it has to be from the highest levels. And related to that is accountability. I've seen in other sectors pre-competitive collaboration fail simply because it wasn't built into individuals' KPIs. If this isn't your day job, if you don't get bonuses because of working together, it won't be surprising how little effort is put into working together. Skill. This is a technology. Learning how to work together is a technology, and having a facilitator, convener who are expert at leading conversations, helping groups find common interest, and then articulating conclusions is very, very valuable. It's simply not worth the time of fooling around having conversations that are not professionally led. And then finally, social connection. There's no doubt that in Global Salmon Initiative and in other areas where I've done things like this, people come because of self-interest. But sit in a room after a couple of hours and you realize that people actually like being members of communities. They enjoy it. Even though we may be competitors as salmon farmers, we are part of a community as salmon farmers. That sense of group belonging makes things more effective. And I would add, I certainly believe, that sense of belonging is a value in and of itself. There is a deep satisfaction, which sort of takes me right back to the beginning when I suggested that we are fundamentally a very social species. So that takes us to the end of the formal presentations, and I see a couple. I'm just going to gather the questions as they come in. I saw one easy question and one hard question. So I'm going to start with the easy question, which was this initiated by WWF, or did they quietly cajole us into doing this, or were they brought in? And I'm going to give you a very clear historical answer. We didn't talk to WWF until we decided what we wanted to do. This was the result of an industry conversation in which industry CEOs said we need a new way of doing things because the way we've been doing it hasn't been working, and it evolved over fairly detailed conversations. It took a few hours coming back together and together. When we knew where we were going, and after we agreed on ASC, we called WWF. And only then. The decision on ASC was, I'd say, 90% taken before we spoke to WWF. I got to answer a supplementary question, which is, because a lot of people say, well, GSI is all about getting ASC. No, GSI is all about environmental performance. ASC was chosen as a goalpost, a marker, a way of operationalizing our ambition. But it's there for convenience. It's not an end in itself. Our worry was that if we just said we're going to become more sustainable without setting up a clear objective reference point, it would turn into greenwash. And the choice of ASC as a reference point is it was the closest thing to something that the environmental groups and the general community would respect as being sufficiently demanding for our level of ambition.
If I may compliment Avrim on your answers,
please.
Is that okay?
Yeah,
yes. Yeah, it's important to remember that it took us almost a year between the minute where we first initiated our conversation back in early 2012 in Brussels and the time GSI was actually launched and presented to the stakeholders. So it was a very thoughtful process of understanding where we were standing at the moment, where we wanted to be in the future, and a lot of thinking process within the companies and among ourselves to get to a point to be able to sign a memorandum of understanding almost a year after we initiated the initial conversations. And second about GSI and ASC is, ASC is a tool, it's a mean, but it's certainly not the goal. The goal that we have in our mind is to become the most sustainable source of healthy protein in the globe. And that has to do everything with reputation, global reputation of farm salmon. It's much more than ASC.
Thank you. The hard question I saw came in very quickly by someone who no doubt once an answer was, okay, so you guys have been cooperating for 4 years, you haven't solved sea lice, so you're certain this cooperation works? So it's not a question I was particularly keen on getting, but the answer is yes, I'm absolutely certain, but so far the sea lice have maybe been smarter than we've been. But if you sat in those committees and watched how we've approached it, it's hard not to be impressed. For example, when one company invested in laser treatments, rather than everybody doing it and keeping the results secret, the results have been shared time and time again so that if anyone else wants to go there, they have A, is it worth the money, and B, how best to do it. When we realized that sometimes treatments were relatively ineffective because We didn't have area cooperation. We immediately got together the people responsible for treatments and got watershed-wide cooperation. When the feed companies suggested that maybe there could be functional feeds that would reduce sea lice infestations, rather than one feed company with one farmer doing tests, we invited all the feed companies to run blind trials with farmers in all regions and quickly saw the results. So what would have taken probably 10, 15 years of progressive study of this, we learned very quickly where there was potential and where there wasn't. When it looked like the regulation for sea lice in Chile wasn't really reflecting the state of the art, we actually invited the Chilean officials for technical tours and compared notes. So biological questions are hard, and cooperation doesn't create magic wands. What it does create is faster technical progress.
Let me compliment you on your answer, Avrim, and I can have a good example. Back in 2013, we have a major sea lice problem in Chile, and it was the work that we did within the sea lice committee within GSI that gave the Chileans the opportunity to find out good practices and experiences elsewhere to be applied to Chile, and that was one important source of solving the crisis back in 2013. We haven't eliminated sea lice because sea lice is part of the environment, so it cannot be completely eliminated. The important point is to keep it in control, and that's what we did in 2013, thanks to the GSI platform that allow us to share our views and experiences on how to control it.
Okay. So I am having trouble finding the questions. I know this should be obvious, but it's not to me.
While you are seeking, I have one that is probably in my area, and it's about algae oil. The question is, the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids from algae oil, does it make them more comparable to fish oils in nutritional value than other alternatives? So the interesting thing with algae oils and algae that we are cultivating now is that they are actually the natural sources. That's in algae in the marine web or food chain. It's in algae where these fatty acids are synthesized. So in practice, it is the same fatty acids we have in algae oil as we find in fish that we extract. There are some modifications because there are different ratios depending on different algae species, and some are higher in DHA, some are higher in EPA, and some doesn't have the mix. So we would need to, in a way, if we're going to mimic exactly fish oil, then we will need maybe to have a selection or a blend of several algae sources. But it will be exactly the same omega-3 fatty acids that we have from fish oil. And when it comes to future use, yes, we think that algae oil will be a significant proportion of the diet in the coming years. First, more maybe like a specialty, but as cost comes down and scale comes up, we foresee that this will be a significant proportion of the fish diet, and probably not only in salmon but also in other aquatic species.
I have another question here referring to my statement of producing the most sustainable source of protein in the planet, and whether do we think that salmon producers should be looking to diversify into other species that require lower marine ingredients inputs. It's a good question. My position today is that no, we should specialize and let salmon become the most sustainable, healthy protein in the globe, because salmon in itself contains such an enormous advantage in terms of the efficiency in which it's being farmed, the yields that it takes, the digestibility of the protein that it contains, the nutrients that it contains. That is very hard for another protein to be as good and effective in providing healthy protein to the planet. What we aim to do is to keep salmon well fed and ensuring that the marine ingredient sourcing is sustainable, and that is precisely a component of ASC certification that refers to the marine ingredients of the feed. That was the reason why we initiated the project that was so well described by Einar some minutes ago, precisely in our endeavor to find out novel oils that could bring additional omega-3 to the diets.
Maybe if I would like to add a little bit to the statements. The technology that is developed through salmon farming and through the innovative salmon farmers is floating to other species as well. And then I'm not talking just about nutrition, but vaccines, preventive health, genetics. A lot has started with salmon, but even though the salmon farmers necessarily haven't gone multi-species, the technology is transferred through suppliers and other parts in the value chain. So it's obvious that the technology development and leadership that salmon farming has is also bringing success to other aquatic species and making them more sustainable.
Okay, there's a question about whether GSI is a legal structure or just a coalition of the willing, and the answer is it is strangely a coalition of the willing. Whether in the long run this is how we want to be remains to be decided. Right now it exists by virtue of the signatures of CEOs saying they commit to the three principles of significant improvement in sustainability, transparency, and cooperation. We have no offices. If you try and find GSI on the map, you will find we are everywhere and nowhere. And no permanent staff. There's some Sophie Ryan and myself and some people in London, Donald Cameron and Lucy Hager. We all work on sort of a casual basis, though it doesn't feel casual at all to us, doing this. And there is a reason for that. One, of course, it allows a lot of flexibility, and you can sort of grow and develop in response to the needs of the industry. So we're a very young organization. But the other is that our experience with associations, industry associations, is if you've got fixed costs like payrolls and salaries and a bit of organizational culture, pretty soon you focus as much on how to keep the organization alive as on the mission. And we don't have that conflict. And one of the key things that it has given us is the capacity not to put membership above mission. And many of you will have experienced that regional associations and even global associations have a tendency to get dumbed down to the level of aspiration of the least ambitious members. GSI, when we formed it, the CEOs had a quite frank conversation, and the answer was, we want to be an ambitious organization, and if there are members who find our level of ambition too large, they can leave. Because sustaining membership is not our goal, but achieving value is our goal, we're able to do that, whereas more formal organizations so quickly fall into the trap of, well, we can't afford to have people leave. I'm sensitive to the fact that we have 5 minutes left and I'm supposed to hand it back to the seafood source administrators. So back to you.
Thank you very much. Before we close out, I just have a few housekeeping notes for everyone. A lot of people have been asking about the on-demand version of this webinar. You will receive an email within 2 days with the on-demand version of this webinar and a PDF link to the presentation today. So look for that in your inbox in the next 2 business days. We'd also love to hear your feedback on today's session. When you close out of the meeting window, a short survey will pop up. We'd love your feedback, which will help us in developing future webinars. I want to thank our 3 presenters again today, Avrim, Ricardo, and Einar for a great presentation. This webinar brought to you by seafoodsource.com and sponsored by GSI. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you, Seafood
Thank
Source.
you.
And in your feedback, say something nice about us trying to do this for the first time. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.